We're excited today to bring to you NCS T10. If you're in the wrong place, this is your last chance to dash out of the room. It is how can internet routing security be improved? And we have two special guests from the other side of the country, Jonathan Cederbaum, who will introduce more details about himself, and Cecilia Testart. So we've got 40 minutes. They're very excited about having 10 minutes of questions. So please, as it's time for questions, line up by, I think we only have one microphone. Oh no, there's the other one. Two microphones in the room, so that we can get the Q&A active and dynamic. So we're here to educate and answer, or at least they are. I'm gonna get off stage now. Thank you. All yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Internet Routing Security. I'm Jonathan Cederbaum from the George Washington University Law School. I'm going to be giving the second half of the presentation focusing on law and policy, but I'm going to turn it over to my partner to get us going.
Okay, so I'm Cecilia Testart, an assistant professor in the School of Cybersecurity and Privacy at Georgia Tech. And today I'm going to be talking about routing and how we can improve the security. First off, disclaimer. So this is our view based on our work, nothing to do with our employers or even RSA. So let me get started on this by showing you some headlines of recent news. And all that these headlines here have in common is that they've been caused by routing attacks, okay? So I'll be talking to you about routing because of the many ways that different, the malicious actors can attack in the internet. Routing plays a key role because routing is a key protocol, as I'll talk to you in a few minutes, that enables networks to know how to send packets that are destined for IP addresses outside their network and to choose the path of how those packets are going to flow through their networks. So basically, routing is what makes the internet a network of networks. And I've been studying internet security for a long time, looking at the protocols to understand how the different system operators use these protocols and what is the final state of security of this protocol, and trying to distinguish malicious activity from benign activity. And this, what has happened here, is malicious activity. So let's take a look at what we have here. What you can see that in here we can see some very well-known names such as Google, AWS, Cloudflare. You can even, maybe a little bit smaller there, see US Air Force. So all of these are very large organizations that are also capable of attracting some of the best talent out there. And even with that, they are prone to routing attacks. And that is because this protocol, no one network can solve and improve the security. It needs all of the networks and actors in the internet to improve their practices so that we can get a better state of security. So how does routing work? And I'm going to walk you through it so that I can show you one of the attacks that happened in recent years. So as I told you, this is a network of networks that to send then packets through these networks, the networks need to know how to reach these other networks. And the protocol that is used globally for this is called the Border Gateway Protocol. And in this protocol, there are two key pieces of information. The one that you can see over there, which is the IP address blocks that the network use, and that is used in the IP protocol, and the AES number, the autonomous system number, which is the number given by, to these networks that then identify the path that the packets are gonna use through the internet. So let me run you through an example. Let's say this network that has some server there uses that block of IP address space, the 18/16. That network uses this routing protocol, BGP, to advertise that it's using that block of IP address to the next network, and that network then advertises to its neighbor, and then all of these networks then advertise to their other networks. And that's how this information spreads through the internet, and networks in the internet know how to write packets towards that destination. And then using the same protocol, networks decide which is the specific route they're going to use to send the packets towards that destination. And for example here, that networks ends up choosing that path. So that's why the path is relevant of how these packets are going to travel through the network, and the final destination is relevant because that's where the packets are going to be sent in the network. Now, unfortunately, this protocol doesn't have any validation or authentication mechanism to validate the data that the networks are receiving in BGP to know whether or not that information is correct. So what can happen in BGP is that, let's say, these other networks decide to start using that same IP address block. And that network uses the same protocol, generates the same packet as the other network, and sends it to its neighbor. If the neighbor is running BGP, the usual BGP, it has no idea on how to identify that that's not a correct announcement. And because it's, in this case, a very close neighbor, it might choose that route to those sets of IP addresses and pass that on to its neighbors. Same thing happened. They have no way of using just BGP to distinguish this from what would be the legitimate announcement. And that's how these incorrect announcements, sometimes malicious, can spread through the internet. And this is indeed what happened, has happened many times, but in particular, my example is based on 2 attacks that Amazon received in 2018 and 2022. And in these attacks, the attackers were able to attract the traffic, and through that, they stole cryptocurrency. So what happened there is that Amazon, in one of its prefixes, hosts the DNS server for some of their cloud services, and where these, there was a cryptocurrency wallet that was hosted in those services. And so Amazon advertised in this protocol that this is their IP address space. It gets known through the network, but the day of the attack, the attackers decide to start advertising another piece of that address space. And in BGP, the neighbors had no idea that this was not legitimate and spread that message around. And indeed, this attack got a really large spread. Most of the internet was spreading these attacks. So what happened then because of that, given this is in the routing plane, then the malicious actors were able to attract the traffic to their servers, where they use a fraudulent infrastructure that then sends the users to a fraudulent website where their credential and transaction with cryptocurrency were stolen. Okay? So in general, there are different types of harm that can come from BGP hijacks. The most basic one is that because when a hijack happened, the traffic is sent some another way that makes the legitimate services hosted in the victim IP address space unavailable. And an example is a well-known hijack. Pakistan used this to prevent its citizens from accessing content on YouTube. The problem was that then these announcements spread worldwide, and for a few hours, nobody could access YouTube. The other thing that attackers can do with these hijacks is that they can use them to send fraudulent traffic while they're doing the hijack. And this is something that spammers leverage a lot, because that way they can send spam from whatever IP address they want, and sometimes that allows them to evade some of the spam filtering. And in this case, the one that I'm showing you is actually a very clever, interesting use of fraudulent traffic. The attackers use fraudulent traffic to generate revenue on ads. So they will target ad space in web pages and generate fake clicks which monetize their infrastructure. And finally, the attacks can impersonate services, such as what happened to Amazon, where after attracting the traffic, the attackers create a whole infrastructure that reproduces what a user would expect. And through person-in-the-middle attacks, they can steal credentials, transaction, and manipulate the traffic in whatever way they want. Okay, so going up from this attack to the problem in BGP is that basically there is no way for the networks to identify which information in BGP to trust. So the consensus is that the solution to that is to validate information. So the information that comes in this routing protocol needs to be validated to some sort of ground truth. And lately, the emerging solution of that source of ground truth is a specialized public key infrastructure that would enable the network to validate through cryptography the records. And now I'll spend some time explaining to you what that solution is. So in a public key cryptography infrastructure, we first have the root of trust, okay, which is the entity that we're going to trust because it's going to self-sign the certificate and create the cryptographic key that then allows this organization to distribute these pairs of private and public keys to different entities where the public key is used, is made public and is used to verify the records, and the private key is given to the organization, in this case they're going to be network, to sign records or produce records that can be cryptographically verified. So the idea is that once we have this record, anyone that fetches this record, fetches the public key, can walk through the cryptographic tree and verify that that record followed that tree. And the idea is that only the entities that were delegated these pairs of key can issue these records in a way that they can be verified. You have not been delegated such thing. You can never create a record that would be verifiable with the cryptographic infrastructure. So now, how is this applied specifically to routing and to the way that we've been delegating resources in the internet? Well, that is the Research Public Key Infrastructure, or RPKI. So RPKI was standardized by the IETF in 2012 and provide this framework where networks can use cryptographic records that map the IP address block or prefixes to the number of the network that is authorized to use them in BGP. So the first part of this framework is that organizations that hold IP address space issue these records through the cryptographic tree that comes from the regional internet registry that delegated that resource. So the world is divided in 5 zones for distributing internet resources, namely IP address space and the numbers that the networks use. So the regional internet registry distributes this to different organizations, in this example, different networks, and now can provide them the key so that these networks can then create the right certificates to have this assertion that can be verified with cryptography. So here in this example, this network A creates a root origin authorization, as it's called, that type of certificate. For a given prefix, the 18/16, it authorizes the network name A to originate it in BGP. And then the second part of this scheme is that then networks fetch all these records, validate all the cryptography, end up with a set of validated records, and then they use that to make decisions in BGP, in the routing protocol, where when they receive messages in BGP, they validate against their now source of ground truth, and if the record says, in this example, for example, an origin that is not authorized, they don't consider that message in their decision making for how to route packets, and they don't forward that to other networks. So that really prevents the spread of invalid information in the internet. And in exchange, well, if it checks if the information in BGP is correct with respect to what RPKI says, it's included in the decision making and then forwarded to the neighbors. So this part of it is called root origin validation. And for the past years, I've been fascinated in studying the adoption of this protocol and how we can measure this through our view of routing and the impact that it has in internet routing. And I'll show you now a few graphs that, for me, make an understanding of the impact that this solution has had in the internet. So in this graph, I am showing you information that comes from publicly available BGP records for most of the global networks in the internet. And as you can see on the y-axis, the higher up, it's counting the number of invalid routes that a given network is sending to its neighbors. And at the beginning in 2019, you can see that all of those numbers are higher up because nobody was using this protocol in their decision making. And as time goes by, you start seeing some vertical lines that go down. And when they go down, it means that that network suddenly has almost 0 invalid information in the routing table. They are not sending invalid messages to their neighbors. And that's how we infer that they are indeed adopting RPKI because they're using this source for their decision making in routing. And you can see that actually during pandemic in 2020, there was quite a bit of adoption. A lot of the networks go down. And as adoption improves, the overall number of invalid information around in the internet starts decreasing. So currently you can see that, that is just a few months ago, a lot of the networks have very, very low in invalid because there's a lot of adoption, especially in the large networks, of using these information in RPKI to validate what happens in BGP. But there's still a few networks that are not doing this, and that's why they have still somewhat higher numbers of invalid information. But overall, we can definitely see that currently in the internet, there's less invalid information than what was happening even just 5 years ago. And also, another consequence of this is even if there is invalid information, the spread is much less. Not all the networks are going to have those invalid information in the routing table. Now, looking at the other side of RPKI, the creation of these cryptographic records that needs to be used for networks to validate information in BGP. Well, I've been studying that for a long time, and it turns out because those cryptographic records needs to be in the tree of the regional internet registry that delegated the piece of address space, then the tooling that each of these regional internet registry has a big impact in adoption. And each of the zones of the internet have independently developed their tooling. And here what we're seeing, because in blue I have all of the world, and in red is this zone for North America that depends on the ERIN registry, because it's the registry for North America. And it turns out in North America, there's less adoption of RPKI than there is worldwide. And I'm showing you two lines because the dotted line at the bottom is for small organizations. And we have figured out that indeed small organizations are lagging behind in the adoption of this protocol. So it's harder for them to figure out how to issue these cryptographic records for the piece of address space that they were delegated. But I've also studied the RPKI adoption on very large networks. So what this graph is showing is the level of adoption by how the percent of the address space that a network originates and uses, and how much of that is covered by RPKI. And here I'm just showing you tier 1 networks, which are the really, really big networks, such as AT&T, Verizon, Level 3, Deutsche Telekom, and Orange. And what you can see here is that some of these networks over time flip and go on very high levels. They decide one day, okay, we're now pushing adoption, and they're able to adopt it very quickly. But you can also see that there's some other networks that have a much slower adoption. And when we've inquired what's going on here, it turns out that depending on how networks operate and how they delegate pieces of their address space to their customer and what they enable the customer of doing, and for example, being multi-home with another network and then having themselves further customers, this has implications when you adopt the protocol and requires much more coordination between the different networks. And that makes adoption more challenging. And the other thing that you can see is that in these very, very large networks, there's still some of them that decided we're just not adopting because we're not going through this process at the moment. So still, currently, RPKI, I think about a month and a half ago, it passed the bar where 50% of the IP addresses that are being publicly routed are covered by an RPKI record. So we recently passed the 50% adoption, which is a large level of adoption. And as a consequence too, that means that now what happens in RPKI can really impact what happens in routing, because RPKI is able to modify the behavior and the decision making in the routing protocol. So some few details that I want to also call your attention in this RPKI adoption is that it's not only necessary for adopting RPKI. Here what I'm showing you is a press release when an organization that had adopted RPKI was still attacked by attackers. And in part, it was because the way that this network adopted RPKI was relatively lax, so it could allow for a lot of operational changes. In particular, this network allows that a lot of different network numbers, AES numbers, originate their address space, although they don't usually use all of that. They want to have the ability, if something happened in their network, to very quickly do operational changes. And they didn't realize that attackers then used that ability because they were not using some network numbers, but they were authorized under RPKI to do an attack with those numbers. So there is a trade-off, indeed, in RPKI between having the records that provide the most security and then having flexibility for the operation of routing. And this is something that the organization adopting RPKI need to figure out what is the balance that work properly for their operation. And the other example I wanted to show you, it's also related to operational practices. It was less than a year ago, Cloudflare had an attack, even though Cloudflare, big proponent of RPKI now, covers almost all of their address space with RPKI record. What happened here is that in routing, there are different signaling that can happen that is used for example, in case of a DDoS attack, a denial of service attack, specially crafted BGP message can signal to another provider to just drop something in BGP so that there is no traffic, and then the network can get decongested from the DDoS attack. So what happened here is that a network that was not Cloudflare used this tool of this specially crafted BGP message to signal that they needed to drop all traffic going to a Cloudflare destination because apparently it was under attack. Now, that network was not valid with respect to RPKI, but some of the providers in the internet, before validating RPKI and using RPKI data, they first checked these very critical messages about DDoS protection. So there is no consensus of what should happen before. Do you trust RPKI before and then you proceed of doing DDoS protection? Or DDoS is something that needs such quick operation that we don't have time to verify the cryptography on the side. So those are ongoing conversation of how to put priority in these different operational practices. And finally, as I talked to you, well, now BGP covers more than RPKI covers more than 50% of the routed address space. And about a year ago, some hackers used an RPKI as a vector of attack. What happened here is that the RPKI records are created through the portals of the regional internet registries. And Orange, for their subsidiary in Spain, the administrator for that account had a password RIPE-admin. And the account got hacked. The attackers got access to all the management infrastructure for the certificate, and they modified the certificates from Orange. And they changed the legitimate origin in the cryptographic records, and then all legitimate routes of Orange for Spain, they were dropped because it was signaling RPKI that those were not valid anymore. And the challenge here is that currently there is no monitoring or system that lets you know when a new certificate in RPKI appears or is changed. Networks need to create their own tooling to know this. So it took Orange actually reading the tweet or X announcement of the hackers saying that they had done that to figure out that this was going on. And indeed, then anything that happens with RPKI impacts routing. And something that I started to track is that these cryptographic trees that depend on the regional internet registries, they can become unavailable, or they can have operational issues that make all the crypto not possible to validate. And when that happens, it means that it has implication on which records are valid and not valid, and that again creates changes in routing, because now these records are covering more than 50% of address space. So basically, the story that I'm telling you is that one single network cannot necessarily meet secure routing for themselves, but that all different networks and organizations that hold address space can work together to improve the security in routing. And that is a collective action problem, which is why policy is interested in it.
Thank you, Cecilia. So as Cecilia said, she has laid out the scope of the problem for you and described a very promising technical response through RPKI adoption. But how do you ensure breadth of adoption? And as Cecilia said, it's a collective action problem. And so when there's a collective action problem, who steps in but the government? And so in the second half of our presentation, I'm going to describe to you two initiatives the US government has taken very recently to try to promote RPKI adoption. Those two initiatives are from the Office of the National Cyber Director, which in September of 2024 put out a roadmap document for enhancing internet routing security. And the second is from the Federal Communications Commission, which in June of 2024 put out a proposed rule to impose new obligations on major internet service providers with respect to RPKI adoption. For each of these initiatives, I'm going to tell a story with 3 chapters. Chapter 1 will be origins. How did these initiatives arise? Chapter 2 will be contents. What are the key elements? And chapter 3 will be where are we now? What's the status of these efforts, and do they show any prospect of actually succeeding? So let me start with the Office of National Cyber Director roadmap document. It has 2 immediate origin points. The first is the National Cybersecurity Strategy that was put out in March of 2023. That was one of the first efforts of the newly created Office of National Cyber Director. And that report argued that we needed 2 fundamental shifts in cybersecurity policy. First was we needed to rebalance responsibility for cyber defense from end users to what the report called the most capable and best positioned actors in cyberspace. And Cecilia has already described who some of those are when it comes to internet routing security. The second major shift in the National Cybersecurity Strategy was that we needed to realign incentives to focus on longer-term investments. When it came to those longer-term investments, one of the focuses of the report was on what you might call the architecture of the internet. The report divided its recommendations into 5 pillars. The 4th pillar was called Securing the Technical Foundations of the Internet. And that was both a reflection of this need to rebalance and the need to engage in longer-term investments. And the strategy highlighted a number of aspects of internet architecture that needed much more focused attention. One of those was BGP insecurity. Others, just to give you a sense, was the transition to IPv6. Another was the problems of unencrypted communications in the DNS system. So this was one of the most important, though, of these internet architecture changes that the cybersecurity strategy recommended. That was in March of 2023. Since then, we've seen 2 implementation reports that have followed up the strategy with much more detailed assignments of how different parts of the government and with recommendations for the private sector about how to carry forward these goals. One of those implementation plan instructions was to develop a method for promoting RPKI adoption. And so that's why we got the ONCD's roadmap document in 2024. So what are some of the key elements of the document? I'm going to mention 5. First, I think a fundamental purpose of the roadmap was simply to raise the priority of the issue and to promote the importance of RPKI adoption as a matter of, as Cecilia said, this collective action problem needs everybody on board. And so by putting out a roadmap, it was a way of telling everyone, pay attention. Second, the roadmap called for, and we now have, a public-private working group that will carry forward the recommendations developed in the report. and I'll tell you a little bit more about that public-private working group's composition later. But the working group had two key tasks. One was to develop criteria and a framework for operators, network operators, to assess risk and prioritize IP addresses that were most urgently in need of RPKI adoption. And second was to develop a playbook that network service providers could use with their customers to promote RPKI adoption. A third key element of the report contained a series of recommendations for the government itself. The notion was that the government should lead the way, and by showing itself to be good at RPKI adoption, it could inspire private parties to do the same. So when it came to the government, the report, as government reports often do, assigned different tasks to different agencies. First, the Office of Management and Budget, which is an important office in the White House, was told that it should establish reporting mechanisms for measuring federal agency uptake of RPKI. Second, NIST was told that it should update its technical standards with respect to internet routing security. Third, CISA was given the task of outreach to the private sector, basically to go on a campaign of evangelizing for RPKI adoption. Fourth, the State Department was told to reach out to foreign partners because, of course, the internet is a global institution. The United States can't do it alone. The State Department of the Biden administration was reorganized to create a special office and a special ambassador-level official to engage in this kind of digital diplomacy. And that official was assigned to carry out these discussions to make adoption of RPKI a subject of international discussion. And then finally, the recommendation was to increase R&D funding in this area. So folks like Cecilia can do their work and help everybody figure out how to develop these protocols more effectively. A fourth element of the roadmap consisted of recommendations not for the government itself, but for network operators. And the report divides its recommendations for network operators into a baseline set and then some additional ones. There were 4 baseline recommendations. One was that they should engage in risk-based planning to develop, maintain, and periodically update cybersecurity risk management plans and include within those plans internet routing security as an essential element. Second, that network operators should, as Cecilia was indicating, publish route origin authorizations, create them and publish them through the appropriate repository. Third, that network operators should work with their customers to put into their contractual agreements understandings that would promote RPKI adoption by customers. And fourth, to set up a system of monitoring to see how, from their perspective on the internet, how much RPKI adoption they could see and see if we were making progress or not. The final element was, as I said, a group of 3 additional recommendations for network operators. One was to deploy the technology needed to engage in what Cecilia mentioned as ROV filtering. That's not the initial registering of the origin's authenticity, but checking to see when you receive something, is its route origin valid? Second was to help customers do their own RPKI adoption. And third was to make public the methods they were using to improve their own routing security practices in the hope that companies seeing best practices from others in the network could learn from those and adopt them themselves. So the roadmap had many recommendations, you can see. That was about a year ago. Where are we today? The bottom line is we've seen some progress, but only the beginnings. And I wanted to mention just three items that reflect some of that progress. First is an executive order that President Biden issued just before he left office. That executive order contained a number of directives that mapped onto the recommendations for the federal government that were in the roadmap document from the OECD. Second is, as I mentioned, the creation of the Secure Internet Routing Working Group. That group has indeed been convened. It's chaired by officials from the Office of National Cyber Director and CISA, and their private sector counterparts are the heads of two of the sector coordinating councils under DHS's Critical Infrastructure Partnership Council, the council heads for the IT and communications sectors. They are pursuing 4 lines of effort, again in line with some of the recommendations we saw: developing risk criteria, developing playbooks, educating the relevant community about the importance of RPKI adoption, and developing metrics. They also have been engaged in some discussions with international partners, but mostly so far they are operating under the radar. Last, NIST has, consistent with the recommendation in the roadmap, released, as many of you may know, or some of you may know, a first public draft or a revision of its special publication about internet routing security. The original version came out in 2019. NIST put out the new version in January of 2025. Comments were open. They were open for comments till the end of February, and they need to produce the final version of this updated special publication by August. So that was a very quick tour through the ONCD's roadmap on internet routing security. I'm going to give you an even speed, because I see the timer in front of me, I'm going to give you an even speedier tour through the Federal Communications Commission's proposed regulations. So, as I said, Chapter 1, Origins. I can tell you the origins here in 3 words. Those words are national security, comma, China. Okay? A lot of the reason that the Federal Communications Commission jumped into action is that important parts of the government, particularly the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, were increasingly concerned about the ability of adversaries of the United States to use BGP hijacking to threaten the national security of the United States. Above all, China and companies, large companies tied to the Chinese government, have been shown to be very sophisticated at BGP hijacking, and some of the biggest incidents we've seen have come from those sources. And those hijackings can enable the hijackers to engage in espionage by surveilling the traffic that they may divert. And so that can be a major national security threat. So prompted by that concern principally, since 2022, the FCC has been working on this problem. In 2022, it put out an initial notice seeking public comment. Then, of course, you had the National Cybersecurity Strategy. In 2023, both CISA and the FCC got together and held a workshop on the problem. And then, finally, in 2024, we had the FCC proposing regulations for US internet service providers. So, Chapter 2, what are some of the key elements of those proposed rules? My animation is off, so the key, the most substantial requirements in the proposed rules would apply to Tier 1 service providers. So I'm going to focus on those. And they would be required to file with the Commission these BGP routing security plans. What would be in those plans? First, they'd have to provide a detailed description of their process for assessing and prioritizing the creation and maintenance of route origin authorizations. So again, the whole theory of the proposed rule is not to impose requirements directly, but to require disclosure, to require reporting. And the idea behind it, which some have questioned, is if you require reporting, it will promote uptake. So if the service provider does not control some of the IP addresses that it knows about, it needs to describe the status of the registrations for the routes they do originate, explain the reasons why they're unable to register particular sets of prefixes, and describe in detail their efforts and plans for facilitating ROA registrations for the IP prefixes that have been transferred to and not under its control. There is a big problem in North America, in part with legacy prefixes, and it's not always clear who will have control over particular address blocks. Oops. Okay. More for the big internet service providers. They have to they also have to describe the extent to which they've implemented filtering. That's checking whether the messages they're receiving are valid, and to do so at interconnection points on the internet with its peers as well as with its customers, and the extent to which that filtering has been disabled or not deployed on its network. Okay, then they have to file these initial plans, and then they have to periodically file new ones once a year, unless they can attest that they have registered and maintained ROAs covering at least 90% of the originated routes for the address prefixes they control. So there's an ongoing reporting obligation unless they really improve their practices. They also have to make quarterly security filings with less detailed information, but sort of updates on what they're seeing about the security of internet routing and where they are in their progress toward achieving higher levels of adoption. And then finally, the proposed regulations do address service providers that are not the big plans. Those smaller service providers also have to develop the same kinds of plans with the same contents, but they don't have to file them with the commission. They have to just keep them in hand and have them ready should the commission want to take a look at them. So the burden on smaller providers will be a little bit less. So NPRM stands for Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. So when you put out a proposed rule, the public can comment. Quite a few comments poured in, as you can see here. And what were some of the common themes? Avoid prescriptive regulation, right? Don't impose requirements directly. Work through the international multi-stakeholder organizations. Okay, one of the comments from one of those groups said that the FCC was intruding into internet routing security. And so there's quite a bit of pushback, I would say, to one government, even an important government, getting involved by itself. There were also comments suggesting that RPKI is not the only way to go forward, and Cecilia already mentioned some of the, RPKI is not flawless. And then also, as is often the case with parties who may be subject to a regulation, they wanted greater clarity about exactly what their obligations would be. Okay, finally, what's going to happen with these FCC proposed regulations? Normally, when an agency like the Commission puts out proposed rules, they get comments, and then they consider the comments, sift through, and then put out a final rule, hopefully reflecting the suggestions from the commenters. But I think, alas, or for those who don't want the FCC involved, happily, the FCC rules are not likely to come to fruition anytime soon, at least not under the Trump administration. And there are two reasons. The first does not have to do directly with the Trump administration. It has to do with the legal basis for the rules. They were issued under a part of the Federal Communications Commission's authorizing statute that refers to common carriers, and it assumes that internet service providers qualify as common carriers. That notion has been very controversial. It was fought out in the context of the internet neutrality rules. And just in January of 2025, one of the federal courts of appeals, the Sixth Circuit out in Ohio, concluded in an important opinion in the context of internet neutrality that the internet service providers are not common carriers. Okay? If that view of the law is upheld, then the FCC does not have the authority to issue regulations for ISPs. Notably, the Trump administration did not appeal that decision. So that's binding law in part of the country. The second uncertainty is, what's the Trump administration going to do? All the effort I've described so far was done by the Biden administration, including the proposed rules. And as we know, in many areas, the Trump administration has been quite hostile to things that the Biden administration has done before. The new chair of the Federal Communications Commission, who was elevated to the chair by President Trump, has been quite aggressive in his denunciation of many things done by the Biden Commission and of many aspects of the Commission's regulatory program. So the future of these regulations remains very uncertain, but the need for greater attention to internet routing security is certain. So I'm going to stop there, even though we ran over a little bit, and turn it over to Cecilia to zoom through here.
Yeah. So what can you do? So then it's a question, if you host any service online, well, how is your address space? Is it being protected or not by RPKI in any way? Is your provider at least filtering out the records that are invalid so that your address space is protected under them and that you also don't get things that are invalid from your provider? And if you're an internet service provider, what is your status of RPKI adoption? Like, how are you doing with all this root origin authorization and the root origin validation? And given we know that there is a lot of interaction to properly adopt this, if you have customers, and especially if those customers are smaller players, do you support them in issuing their RPKI certificates? How are you integrating that in your system so that it doesn't impact the routing that you're doing for your customers? And then, if not RPKI, what else are you using for monitoring your BGP routes? So finally, as we showed to you, this is not a silver bullet. There's not a solution that works and works easily, but to really solve and to improve the state of routing security, I think the different networks and actors in the internet need to engage so that most of them start improving the practices that they use, and we get a better state of security at the end. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for great presentation. Couple of questions. First, do you see any correlation between IPv4 versus IPv6 and RPKI adoption? Do we see maybe better RPKI adoption with IPv6 prefixes or not? And secondly, do you see any movement from FCC or other regulatory bodies in terms of BGPSec? Obviously, RPKI only protects origin, helps with deaggregation attacks, but is not protecting IS path, which BGPSec is supposed to resolve, but has virtually no adoption whatsoever.
The first one is for you.
So it's an excellent question between IPv4 and IPv6. There is a little bit more adoption in IPv6, so more IPv6 address space is covered than IPv4 address space with RPKI records, but this is a big caveat. Routing in IPv6 works very differently than IPv4. And the size of address space is much less meaningful in IPv6 than IPv4. And if we only look at numbers, we don't really get the right state with IPv6, because, for example, between 2023 and 2024, there was no increase at all in the numbers for IPv6. But a lot of prefixes in IPv6, some networks were routing /32s, and then they modified them for /48. And does it mean that now they have less devices connected in that /48? IPv6 is so large for any of those prefixes that networks have not yet stabilized how they use IPv6, and this shows up in the adoption of IPv6. So we think it's getting better, but the reality is because some networks keep changing how they use IPv6, we don't know for sure. With BGPsec, I don't know if you want to
I'll just say a word about BGPsec and regulators. Both the ONCD roadmap document and the FCC proposed rules describe BGPsec and smile upon it in the sense that they say it's another important initiative to improve internet routing security. But in terms of concrete recommendations or concrete requirements, the focus is entirely on RPKI adoption.
And from the perspective of measuring this, so there's no deployment of BGPsec because there's not even an implementation that is working on the routers. So there's no code that you can put in a router and then implement BGPsec. That said, BGPsec to work requires the RPKI tree to work. So if all networks get used to using this RPKI tree to validate the records that they use for the root origin, then they can know how to use other records to validate other part of the information in BGP. And an in-between step between just using the origin and then going to BGPsec is an effort that now is ongoing at the AETF that is called ASPA, the Authorized Service Provider, the Autonomous Service Provider Authorization. And it creates records that networks can now tell which are their authorized providers. So you can check the origin, and then you can check that the next hop needs to be a match with these records. This is still an ongoing process of standardization. There's been a few tryout of implementation of that, but again, there's still no code. But that said, at least there is a group of companies that is talking about it. So there is some movement. That one.